Does the government work for us or do we work for the government? Have the 100 years of bloodshed that brought us empire also brought us freedom? Tonight, life in the shadow of empire. The 20th century really began on April 25, 1898, when Congress declared war against the Spanish Empire. The Spanish-American War was fought primarily over Cuba, and by the time the war was over, the formerly Spanish possessions of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines came under American control. Guam and Puerto Rico are still U.S. protectorates more than a century later, and the U.S. controlled and exploited the Philippines for over 50 years. The Spanish-American War was a war for empire, and from the deathbed of the Spanish Empire, the American Empire was born. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt militarily backed the secession of Panama from Colombia so that the Panama Canal could be built. In 1905, the United States occupied the Dominican Republic. In 1909, the U.S. sent Marines to help destabilize the government in Nicaragua. In 1915, President Wilson sent U.S. troops into Haiti, and they stayed there for 20 years. 2 years later, Wilson manipulated the United States into a deadly and useless European land war, now known as World War I. In 1923, the Marines occupied several cities in Nicaragua to stabilize the government they had destabilized there just 14 years earlier. Then came World War II, a war born of the inequity of the conclusions of World War I, which placed such onerous burdens on the losers that it fomented the socio-political and economic instability that allowed the mass murderer Adolf Hitler to rise to power. We entered that war after President Roosevelt allowed the Pearl Harbor attacks to be executed. And though the American people, and especially the brave men and women who fought throughout Europe and the Pacific, the greatest generation, had the best intentions, their leaders in Washington did not. The end of World War II cemented the rise of the American empire. American soldiers had just died by the hundreds of thousands so that their gutless political leaders could deliver tens of millions of people across Eastern and Central Europe into the chains of communist oppression. You could say that the United Nations did it. The United Nations being the name that the Allied countries that won World War II gave themselves, and which they formalized as a permanent bureaucracy, now resident on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. In its very first year of existence, the United Nations authorized its very first war, the Korean War. More Americans died, and like World War II itself, it ended with half the affected population living under communism. We are still paying for that war to this day, with significant military commitments in South Korea and a murderous, maniacal regime in North Korea. When President Eisenhower left office in 1961, he warned Americans of the threat of the rising military-industrial complex. And the rejection of his warning by LBJ brought us into a land war in Vietnam that killed 50,000 Americans for nothing. Later, 30 years later, came 9/11. Today we live in a fulfillment of Eisenhower's grim warning. We have active troops on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq and in Libya. We drop bombs on Yemen and Pakistan. We may even be operating secretly in Somalia. And we are at war at home, with militarized police standing guard in our train stations, shopping malls, and national monuments, or worse, breaking down our doors on a whim in the middle of the night and stopping you on the subways to look inside your bags. Who knows where else we might be at war and don't even know about it. We have military commitments in more than 100 countries, and we have 900 permanent military installations around the world. For what? Around the world, the American people and American culture are loved, but the American government is not. An empire that occupies abroad ends up occupying at home. The political class here loves empire because it helps them raise taxes and keeps them in power. But taxing and borrowing that we cannot afford inevitably lead to a loss of freedom. Question: are you better off now than before 9/11? Are you more prosperous now than before 9/11? Are you freer now than before 9/11? The answers are obvious. Everything is worse. Do you see a change of direction coming, or more of the same? Do most political leaders really want to upset the status quo or continue their class in power? Does anyone seriously think that we can simply print cash and borrow our way to prosperity? We can't stand by while we lose our freedom. We don't need an empire. We can't afford to have one. The federal government collects $2.5 trillion a year in taxes and spends $1 trillion of it alone on empire. We need a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. And to get one, we need to fight as hard to change the status quo as the political class has fought to maintain it. All of our freedoms and our existence are at stake.